All right. Well, to get back into it a little bit, I guess I'm curious if there are any cultural practices or habits that Americans are maybe missing out on because of our cultural norms or assumptions. What comes to mind for y'all?
All gays have anal sex.
Mm. Yeah, and in some ways, like, only gays
Or I,
or, like, the really kinky people, like, if you're having anal sex, then you must be, like, one of those sexual deviants. I think that's a narrative in our culture.
Mm.
I think yeah, just
Yeah,
normalizing anal sex in general would be a great thing.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know, being in the community, I know couples that don't ever. Just it's just not a thing they do, and they find ways to have fun without poking it in that particular orifice, and that's fine. As long as everybody's happy and everybody's getting giggly, that's cool, man.
That's
It
perfect. Yeah.
the
I'd like
notions
to
of
really take a moment to highlight that, I think, because we do have sort of a cultural assumption that straight people have sex like this and gay people have sex like that. Gay men have this type of sex, lesbians have that type of sex, and it doesn't need to be a cisgendered heterosexual couple can have amazing sex without penis in vagina being the destination, without it even being a like common aspect of their sexuality. And I think that more people would be having great wonderful sex if they were a little bit more sexually intelligent about these
yeah.
ideas. Because if we say that sex has to look like this, then we start to get upset that we're not having as much sex as we want, as opposed to just enjoying the sex that's available to us. And whether we're talking about erections being a concern, or we're talking about vaginal lubrication, or any of the other things that might get in the way of penis in vagina penetration, there's
Mhm.
beautiful sex to be had, and it doesn't necessarily need to have anything to do with some sort of dysfunction, with some sort of problem. Oftentimes
Absolutely.
people, because of their gender identity, because of their sexual interest, or because of the price of tea in China, they just want to enjoy other types of sexual acts. And perhaps, and I think this in particular is an issue for men, they feel like they're not doing their duty. They feel like, well, if I can't like fuck her hard, then you're not doing sex right. And I just want to delete that notion from people's minds as
Mhm.
best as I possibly can.
Well, and
Your
that's
notion of
basically what
what
I meant.
super straight guys sound like, I love it. Go ahead, Laura.
Is this
They
how
all sound
straight
that
people
way.
talk? Is that how?
Yeah. No, I was just gonna say that's kind of what I meant with my awkward earlier comment where I'm like, well, we should be talking about anal more often, right? Is the idea that like when you make something taboo or difficult to talk about, um, whether people are doing it and are ashamed of it, or whether people are missing out on something that they would find real pleasure in, and they're not getting pleasure in whatever other ways that they're engaging in sex. That has a lot to do with the fact that we make this like cultural narrative that certain things are good and certain things are bad. And the more we're able to break that down, I think the more that people can embrace their own sexuality and either enjoy sex better than they would be enjoying it if they didn't, or if they're already doing it, they can feel less ashamed and know that what they're doing is perfectly fine.
Yeah, perfectly fine, but like also sufficient. And I
Yeah.
think that's maybe a message we don't talk about a lot, because we might say like, oh, well, yeah, you guys should maybe try anal. And maybe the cultural narrative is that if you are one of those like degenerate, like sexy couples that maybe on birthdays or special occasions, or maybe you're even one of those like crazy kinky couples that has anal sex like every 10th time or something. Woo, I just want to say that there's no quota. There's no appropriate ratio. It's not like it's some exotic cuisine that you only cook some of the time. Your idea of a exotic cuisine that you only cook some of the time in some other nation or in some other culture is just Tuesday night dinner. And your sexuality can be much the same way. There is nothing that says that you have to have any particular elements to have a satisfying sex life. And we spend so much time as a culture moaning about the sex we're not having and missing out on opportunities to have incredible sex that's right there available to us.
You just
Absolutely.
reminded
And
me of
to
that scene from The Meaning of Life. Do you remember that when the Protestant guy's there talking to his wife and he's like, "I could have sex anytime I wanted," and she's like, "What?" She's like, "Well, we have two children, and we've had sex twice." He's like, "I could go down to the pharmacy any day and say, Harry, I want you to sell me a condom. In fact, today I think I'll have a French tickler."
As opposed to that Catholic notion of every sperm being special.
Right,
I'm with
exactly.
you.
Yeah. Sorry, I had to throw that in there. Go ahead, Laura.
I love it. No, I was just gonna get back to your point where you were talking about the fact that anal is not necessary among gay couples, right? Is the idea that every single person has a different type of sexuality and a different thing that they like or enjoy doing. And when I was studying different sexualities in different cultures, there were a few cultures I came across where the name for a homosexual person, when you translate it to English, is like one who has anal sex, right? And so when
Oh,
you
wow.
said that, I thought about it right off the bat. Like, that's not necessarily true. But that stereotype permeates, like, not just our culture, but at least the other ones that I read about, right? If not more. So it's very
Mhm.
interesting that you brought that up. And it's something that we should probably be talking about more.
Yeah, one of the first gay couples I ever met when I was a teenager, we sort of hit it off and we're talking about it, and I was still kind of more or less in the closet at the time, but that topic
Mhm.
came up, and he told me that that really doesn't happen very often because we're just not into it, and it just blew Nate's teenage mind. I'm like, what? No pokey pokey. How are you? Does that give me that gay card right now? But yeah, that's the way it is. I mean, some like it, some don't. I do. It's great. Give it a try,
Yeah.
folks.
I mean, growing up in a very like conservative Christian environment and having sex like very rigidly defined in all of these ways, heterosexual normative sex that only takes place in the context of marriage. We were told that like, okay, you can kiss and hold hands until you're married. Then after you're married, you have these other options, and it kind of created this like escalator, this idea that like, well, you start by holding hands, then you have your first kiss, and then maybe you make out, and then you go to second base, then third base, and there's like this progression of things. And I remember in high school my grandfather telling me that he and my grandmother still really enjoyed just making out. And it took me a little while to like shake that loose, but I have always kind of held on to that idea that no matter how long you've been in your relationship, no matter what's on the table, I mean, even if you're in the type of relationship where you are tying each other up and fucking each other silly and doing all of these like wild and exciting, wild and exciting things, I hope that people listening to this are maybe taking a moment to think like, well, when is the last time that we made out? When is the last time that we did this sex act or that sex act without it feeling like it was just foreplay? A word that you can probably delete from your vocabulary, by the way. Like, you don't need to be working up towards that eventual moment of intercourse. There's such a variety of things to enjoy and explore.
You make me think of something. It's almost like a public service message, but sex is not necessarily about the orgasm. It's about the journey there,
Mm-hmm.
right? So everything you just said made me think about that. So if people want to work on increasing their sex life or improving it, stop worrying about the orgasm. Just worry
Yeah.
about like whether or not you're enjoying all the stuff leading up to it, and it will happen on its own, sometimes whether you want it to or not, right?
Yeah.
But I think that's exactly what you were saying. Like, just enjoy the process.
Yeah, if we are willing to acknowledge, and I think the three of us are, if we're willing to acknowledge that we largely live in some pretty sex negative cultures, I think the
Yeah.
thing that it might be costing us the most is the variety and the expansiveness of sex. This idea that it really has to be a series of steps that eventually lead to like a very specific and limited number of outcomes is something that we're all poorer for having believed.
Mhm.
Beyond that, I know that we can't just like look around the world and like cut and copy somebody else's culture and graft that onto our own. But I'm curious if there are examples of other ways of living or other ways of being that you feel like maybe we should be taking a closer look at, or maybe leaning more into. Is there anything in particular that stands out as as something that maybe we could benefit from?
So
Hmm.
I love that question, but the first thing that comes to my mind is like sort of a warning that like no matter what we can take positively out of a specific other culture, there's negatives too. There's pros and cons, right?
Mm,
So I have like a couple of examples that I think are just really liberating that I wish that our culture would embrace more. I think we're getting there, but we're not there yet. But then I'm sure there's the negative examples too that come along with it. So my first example is in Cambodia. There's a tribe of people that they're called I don't want to mispronounce it, but it's like Krung, Creung. They when their daughters meet sexual maturity, the fathers go out and build them a hut away from the family house, and in that hut, they're allowed to go do whatever they want. They can explore, they can experiment, they can have sex, and they're encouraged to just explore their own sexuality. And I don't think that, we need to go have huts in our backyards or anything like that. But the idea of teenagers, of sex not being so taboo, it being something that they can explore and be accepted for wanting to go do and learn more about. And we can do it in a healthy way where they can learn about sex without being told like abstinence is the only way. Um, I think that would be hugely beneficial because I think a lot of our problems are when we reach sexual maturity, we're all just told bottle it up, like keep it inside. Don't even masturbate for that matter. Like just take all those hormones and just repress them. And
yeah,
then
you'll
by the
go
time
blind and get hairy palms.
right? And I'm not saying like I'm not saying like, "Oh, teenagers go out have tons of sex." But at the same time I kind of am. Like we should have more healthy ways of approaching sex with young people that they can explore and they can learn about it without it being taboo or without it being not allowed and
You know,
like sort of embrace the fact that they're going to do it anyway, right? Behind their parents' backs. So what can we do to make it safer for them?
Hmm.
I couldn't agree more. I got some pushback from my mother after she learned that I let my oldest teenage daughter have her boyfriend over and spend the night. And she's like, "I can't believe you don't you know they're having sex?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, probably. But you know what? At least I can tell her that, hey, it's okay with me. Are you using protection? Do you need some protection? Do you need to go to the drugstore? That's fine. Like, don't pretend that it's not happening and don't shove it into these shadowy places where it becomes more dangerous. When you bring it into the light, not only do you eliminate that stigma, you can have more healthy conversations with your children, but your children will be more healthy physically and they're not
Hmm.
going to have unwanted pregnancies. They're not, or well, they're not going to have as many unwanted pregnancies, right? Because they're going to be smart about it and they're not going to feel shame about being like, "Hey, dad, I need this. Hey, dad, I need that." It doesn't have to be weird. It's not weird with any of my kids. It maybe was at first, but as you have these conversations, it only gets easier.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I have two adult children, and yeah, when they reached that age of sexual maturity, it was the same thing. It was like, well, I'm not going to encourage you, but I'm also not going to discourage you. And so here's what I'm going to recommend. Like here's how to do it safely, right? And yeah, I have my son, my oldest son, his girlfriend lives out of town. And so he's 18, like he's an adult. But when she came into town, I was like, "Okay, condoms, right? Here's this, here's that." And we didn't discourage it because it was going to happen one way or another, right? And so we sat down and had a conversation with him, not about abstinence or you guys aren't allowed to be in the same room alone together or anything like that. It was more like, "Hey, you've reached that age, you've reached that opportunity. You guys are going to do it one way or another. So let's talk about how to do it safely."
Yeah. And
Absolutely.
useful ideas. And Nate, I'm gonna have you jump on the phones before I get like too far out over my skis. But I feel like in this conversation we are maybe kind of beating up on the notions of culture a little bit. And what I'm really meaning to do is just separate out like culture from biology, because I recognize that we all
Mm,
live in a culture. And we might be able to kind of examine through evolutionary psychology and through cultural anthropology and some of these other disciplines to come to an understanding that, yeah, for the vast majority of the existence of Homo sapiens, that probably teenagers were having sex kind of publicly, kind of perhaps in front of their parents rather than in closed rooms. And we're not advocating for returning to that, but we want to acknowledge that all of these rules and these structures that we've built around these ideas are somewhat arbitrary. Arbitrary doesn't mean useless. It just means that if it's all made up, we shouldn't be pretending that anything is particularly sacred. Is that all fair to say?
Yeah, and
I'm still
measure.
wondering how a Texan makes an ice, it's a skiing metaphor. That's confusing to me, but I'll let it go.
He saw them once on TV.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Watched the Winter Olympics once when I was a kid.